In the distant future, vampires rule the night, but their numbers are dwindling. One podcast is unlike all the others. Half human, half vampire. This is Lefty Speaks, the official podcast for Vampire Hunter D.
Hello, hunters, and welcome back to Lefty Speaks, the Vampire Hunter D podcast, for our third episode. Today, we are going to be diving into a discussion on the first Vampire Hunter D movie, our experiences with it, the differences between the book and the movie, what we think of those differences, things we wish could have made it, and why. Personally, I agree with a lot of the changes, essentially all the changes they made between the book and the movie to fit the constraints. We'll also be talking about the breadth of Kikuchi's work, as there are a lot of things that he wrote that have been adapted. He and Kawajiri have teamed up on multiple occasions that we've learned that a lot of people aren't aware of. So we're going to be diving into some of that as well. So thank you for joining us. I'll kick us off. My experience with the 85 film is, we had talked about in a previous episode, it's how I came across both the original movie and Bloodlust, was sneaking out of my bedroom in the middle of the night as a young teen to watch late night anime on the local UPN channel. And I came across the books years later, and as Dark Horse was putting them out, came across them in my love of comics and all other things, science fiction, fantasy, and I really loved some of the characters in the book. My particularly favorite group of villains in the first movie were the Fiend Corps, and their dynamic, and particularly the scene, it's about halfway in the book, when the Fiend Corps comes across a whole squad of the Frontier Defense Force that was dispatched from the capital to go after them. And Kikuchi goes into a bit of detail talking about the equipment, the training, like who the Frontier Defense Force is, why they are able to roam across the frontier and deal with a lot of the problems they deal with. And, builds them up of what they're able to face, and how the Fiend Corps had a card they had kept hidden that let them take out groups like this, and just, so long as they did a little bit of prep, really just keep them untouched and able to keep fleeing. And when you look at the movie, their leader, Ray Gensei, is still in the movie. He plays a prominent role, but it's really, really different. All the Fiend Corps, you see them as background extras, essentially, in the movie. And, of course, they all get killed by D in different scenes. But that was my example of something in the book that I really loved, that I completely understand why all of their scenes and how much development and screen time they got cut so much between the book and the movie. So,
yeah, I mean, I just jump in that I completely agree. I know you and I have talked about this a lot, Scott, because the Fiend Corps and the Frontier Force are two of my favorites as well. And it obviously, for the same reasons, I understand why they had to streamline the story and the film. It would have been a little too much of a diversion from the main story. I am happy that they had Ray continue, like in such an important, he was in both the book and film a very influential character. Obviously they kind of simplified some of his motives a little bit in the film, but all in all, I agree with you. I think my biggest thing is that I'm the guy that buys the extra long versions of everything. Whether it's Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, I want to know everything, and so I'm the kind of guy that would have wanted a 3-hour movie rather than a 90-minute movie, So, but I understand for many reasons why that didn't happen.
I'm trying to remember when I first saw it. I believe it was on either the USA Network, the cable channel, real late at night, or because I'm getting old, I can't remember. It may have been on the Sci-Fi channel back when they used to do Saturday morning anime, and they would have a commercial like every 90 seconds, which would turn an 86-minute cartoon into a 3-hour movie. So I remember seeing it heavily truncated and edited because I was not aware at the time of the kind of graphic sexual content, and eventually I did see the film unedited, and I didn't know that people drew nudity in anime. It was it was one of the first times I'd ever seen. I mean, this is before Legend of the Overfiend. I didn't know about that stuff either, but it was a very interesting time for me, and I feel like one of the things we have to touch on when discussing the first film is when it was released. Because this is a couple of years before Akira, over a decade or so before Ghost in the Shell. It was a very interesting time in anime history around like 83, 84, 85. And I feel like it's possible it would have been a different film totally if it had been released maybe 2 or 3 years later.
I agree.
You know what I mean? It felt like it was... There's some animation that seems very, very strong, but there's parts of it that feel really rushed. And I don't know if it was I don't know enough about the budgetary issues surrounding the production of the first film, but I'm glad it got made because it also showed me and a lot of other fans out there that you could do animated horror. Because, in the States, I think the closest we would have gotten would have been like The Secret of Nim, and Watership Down, which had really horrific elements in it. But other than Scooby-Doo, I'm trying to think of like what was a truly horrific animated film that had an impact, or animated TV series that had an impact in the States. I mean, that first movie opened a lot of eyes, and I think helped inspire a lot of writers of horror fiction in the States. Because I met a lot of people afterwards who, because of Vampire Hunter D, started to get into what's her name, Anne Rice. And all that stuff. Because there is a kind of tonal similarity in some ways. I mean, it's not as obviously rooted in the American South, but the D world with vampires kind of being in control of things, and then in Anne Rice's world where vampires have been in control of things for a while, there's some connections there. So I feel like it was a watershed event, and a watershed means larger, obviously, but I think it opened up a lot more eyes and doors than people give it credit for.
Yeah, I agree. I unfortunately didn't get to see it until I went to university in 1987. And so I saw like a VHS version of it. So in that sense, I got a really beautiful viewing of it right away without commercials or any editing. And at the same time, I was also into other Japanese anime. I was learning Japanese at the time, so I was a big fan of Lupin Sansei, or in English Lupin the Third, and Gorogo 13. And I could see obviously there's certain artistic influences from Lupin, especially some of the really popular Lupin movies at the time, and even a little bit of Gorogo 13 in Vampire Hunter D. Obviously the tone and the subject matter was very different, but and then a couple years later when I saw Akira, I was like you, I was just thinking, oh my gosh, what if Vampire Hunter D had been like that? Yeah.
And then we ended up getting Bloodlust,
Yeah, much later.
Later, 15 years later, which I'm really glad that got made. This is something we'll get into a little deeper later, but one of the things I don't think a lot of people are aware of is that Kikuchi and Kawajiri teamed up on 4 separate adaptation productions to 4 separate franchises that Kikuchi wrote. That's like, wait a minute, they did how many different collaborations together? And they're diverse.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's I'm really glad that this genre, what got created, opened so many eyes. Because if we didn't get Vampire Hunter D, where would that lead for anime? Would we, have gotten Akira, Ghost in the Shell? Well, if we don't have those, would we have ever have gotten the animated Spawn series on HBO in the 90s?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And if we didn't have that, well, how many other things would we not have? It's one of those, almost think of it as like the butterfly effect, the domino, the little snowball at the top of the mountain that rolled. And today when you look back at it, you're like, all right, how many things did it influence? Because I've seen an interview with Guillermo del Toro talking about his seeing Kawajiri and his work as one of his inspirations. One of the things that motivated him, got him interested in all this. I'm like, well, how many things did Guillermo del Toro do? Well, if Kawajiri was his influence, and Kawajiri saw the '85 D movie and became friends with Kikuchi, and they started making all these adaptations. It blows my mind, that chain of events and how it all daisy chains together. And here we are 40 years later.
Oh my God, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Talking about this.
No,
Still.
Thanks.
Wow.
You're welcome.
Yeah. My birthday's tomorrow. I don't need to be reminded how old I am.
Well, happy birthday, either way, right? It's funny.
Indeed.
I used to work at a store in Boston, and if any people here, any of our listeners may remember this, there used to be a chain of stores in the Northeast called Anime Crash. And there was one in New York, one in Providence, and one in Harvard Square in Boston. That's where I worked at, the Harvard Square. And I worked there in 1997, and that was about 2 or 3 years before Bloodlust hit the States. And even then, when all you had was just that one original Vampire Hunter D movie, we still had a lot of people deeply excited about just that one movie. And it had been gone out of the consciousness for quite some time, but I believe there was a re-release sometime in the mid to late 90s. It may have been Streamline. I can't remember. It was either Streamline Pictures or Animigo. One of them re-released it.
Yeah, and then a couple years ago, just before COVID, there was the '85 film got a Blu-ray remaster by Sentai, and then Bloodlust got also a limited release Blu-ray remaster by Discotek.
Right. And I'm glad that those folks exist, because Sentai has been keeping some really cool stuff available, like Legend of the Galactic Heroes,
which they just lost that license, actually.
They did. Well, I'm glad I bought that super duper extremely expensive box set.
You see, I wish I had done that, and I missed it, and I kick myself.
That thing is worth some serious money now.
Yes, and they only made 1,000 of them. I'm really sad that they didn't. They had said that they were going to make a non-collector's edition with all the bells and whistles.
They said that,
and that never got made, which made me sad, because I'm like, wait a minute, you made 1,000 of these things for like $800, and I came on it after the fact, and I'm like, wait a minute, it's sold out. So why didn't you? I mean, mysteries that we'll probably never know the answer to.
And the funny thing, I also have a bunch of these limited collection things, and I think, oh my God, how much money they're worth now, but I'll never sell it anyway.
I can't sell it. Like,
does it really matter? I can't like take a mortgage out on my nerd collection, which is probably more valuable than anything else.
In its box,
oh my God, Escaflowne.
Unopened. This is the original box set with the Escaflowne action figure in it, and there's a reason it's still in its box. But I love this thing. It's sitting here on my shelf.
I can't keep things in boxes. I've got as I think all three of us, I've got a massive collection of nerdy stuff.
It doesn't stand up very well on its own.
If they had been kept in the box, I could be selling them for lots of money. But unfortunately, I usually take something and I then give myself some date to reward myself unpackage this. I put it on a shelf and go, okay. Like my one of my most recent ones was Samurai Boba Fett, and
Oh
it
yeah,
like
yeah.
sat on the shelf for a long time, unboxed, and it's like I do not get to unbox this until I achieve certain, goals that I set for myself.
Yeah.
And it just sits there. And if I'm lazy or I'm procrastinating, that thing reminds me, like I haven't opened it until I accomplish my goal. So
Okay, I like that. I like that as a self-reward motivator goal.
it's very hard. It's very tempting, but if you could stick to it, the first few are the hard ones. After that, it just kind of like, yep, that's the way it is. That's how it goes.
The sad part is my motivation for not opening the Escaflowne one is that old one. It doesn't stand very well on its own. So I've left it in its packaging because it's hard to display it. And I realized that. I'm like, wait a minute. Yeah. But over here you see if I can click at my camera, there's the StarCraft Warpig.
Wow.
I got that. I picked up with the original StarCraft game. And it's got the little fire extinguisher on it. It's got its gun that fits in its hands and it stands on its own. So like I unboxed it and stuck it on the shelf, and it's been sitting on my shelf since the original StarCraft release.
Well, since we're talking about, the Vampire Hunter D, like the first book and all that stuff, connected to that anime crash story I just told was the fact that at the New York location, they had co-sponsored something at like some kind of Japanese American art museum, some kind of exhibit, and Yoshitaka Amano in like 2000 had showed up in New York City. And one of the interesting things is, if you look, I have the omnibus in my hand of the first few books, and a lot of this artwork was there, and they were giving out prints signed by Amano.
Wow.
That I probably trying to drive back from New York to Boston at the time, probably got all wrinkled and destroyed. And speaking of something I wish I had kept in pristine condition, was that, and I don't remember if it was a Vampire Hunter D print, but he was doing Final Fantasy, art print, like he was just signing stuff. And he was such a very nice man. That's the one thing I remember about meeting Amano. And I also said to people, even if you're not a reader, owning these omnibuses, I mean, it's just beautiful because a lot of them are wrap around. Yeah. And, it's just nice to have this art in a digest format. You can just carry it around, and there's always little illustrations on the inside too. So even though I'm not making any money off of hyping this, but if you are a fan, the more support that exists from people buying stuff like this leads to us being able, talk about a butterfly effect. The more fan support, the more fan sales of legitimate Vampire Hunter D media, it'll boomerang back to us, and it'll make it easier for us to keep producing stuff for you guys.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing how that works. When I was working at Davis Films, someone would come in with their IP, like the comic book, or I'm a big Legend of the Five Rings fan, and I was talking to kind of the company owner that owned Legend of the Five Rings at the time, and he was like, yeah, we've got about like 800,000, solid fans. And I'm like,
wow,
but to make a feature film, that's not even remotely enough. It's like, okay, that's a nice, now today, maybe it's a little bit better because we've got, there's lots of streamers that want content. But if you're going to try to break out a new IP as a feature film, you need to be the number one film of that weekend. Otherwise, it's done. And so that's one reason why, even as much as I hate it, that's one reason why a lot of big IP are gobbled up and used, because like for example, Resident Evil 4 cost about $50 million to make, but the promotion 50 to 60, but the PR package was the same. It cost as much to promote the movie as it does to make the movie. So, if you have, and that's an incredibly huge video game, and after several very successful feature films, and we still had to spend that much money to market the movie. So, in Silent Hill 2, we had there was a hurricane and flooding on the East Coast, and that obviously people, I'm not as happy with Silent Hill 2 as I am with Silent Hill 1, but still the flooding and storms on the East Coast closed a lot of theaters, and that seriously affected our opening weekend numbers, which, that's all it takes, so there can be, then you need good word of mouth to then rebuild
Right.
a slow opening weekend. And so, yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, there are. I spent a couple years working for Regal Theater's West Coast corporate office, and it was really interesting getting to see all the numbers for every weekend on Monday, and seeing which films won, which films lost, and hearing all the different executives and people in the office dissect why they think it performed the way it did, how we're adjusting, how we're planning for the future. And it's a little crazy. This last year, I read an article for every year there's a convention of all the different movie theater owners, everybody tied to the feature film industry
NATO,
on the distribution side.
Is it called NATO?
I'm sorry. I don't remember the name of it. I'm terrible with names and acronyms. That's why I got a B in anatomy and physiology in college. Names don't stick me. I can still tell you the inner ear, the crystal, the form, how it's all put together, what it looks like. I can't tell you the name of anything. And I haven't studied medicine in 20 years because I decided not to become a doctor. So anyway, so at this conference this last year was the first time anime had ever been discussed. And up until now, the only time a anime movie ever made it into theaters was Disney's Ghibli, when they adapted those and redid them because it was Disney doing it, or like a Fathom event or a limited run where some group was independently booking theaters for a very limited release. This was the first time anime and anime movies had ever been presented to theater owners as a legitimate, this is something you should consider having as a part of your regular booking cycle. And I'm reading this article about the experience of the reporter sitting in this presentation that Sony had put on because they've bought Funimation and Crunchyroll and merged it all together. Sony's obviously a major distributor of their films. They've got a whole movie studio. Nobody at the theater owners really care. They're not the demographic that's going to be familiar with it. Their theaters almost never see animated movies. And the reporter wrote everybody was distracted. Nobody was really paying attention. They were there because it was Sony, and it's a chain of presentations. So they don't clear out the auditorium between each of the bits for this segment. When the rep from Sony explained how many billions the anime industry now generates every year, they said it was like a light bulb went off in everyone's head, and all of a sudden no one was distracted by their phones anymore. Their eyes got wide, and they were all of a sudden very interested in anime movies, which they had never heard of or cared about before, because they realized how much money was now involved. But the problem with introducing anime movies to the context of what we've been discussing, there's 52 weekends in a year. 2. That's it. There can be at most 52 winners in the theatrical film industry every weekend. And for theater owners, it's a crazy dance because they get a percentage of the box office that they negotiate with the studios for every single film. It changes. And it's a crazy dance that everybody hopes they'll make money on. And theaters don't get a great, especially for what studios and everybody thinks will be the winners, they don't get a big cut of the ticket sales. If you wonder why popcorn is $10, $20 a bucket, well, because that's what keeps the theater open. You buying that ticket, almost all of it that opening weekend is going to the distributor and then the studio. And then maybe
Yeah, I mean it's a scale.
the producers.
Yeah, I mean like at the longer it's in the theater, the more we get, the more the theater gets. Yeah. The percentage wise.
And so it's this crazy dance, but I'm excited that we have hit a time period where we've come from anime, like the original Vampire Hunter D being so niche it was difficult to find, to today Sony is pitching that same category of movie to theater owners as a possible theatrical release in the United States.
Right.
That is such a paradigm shift.
Yeah,
of the perception
and
of animation,
and inspiring, TV, live action TV series like One Piece, and it's really amazing how it has evolved here in the States. To get back to talking about, when we're talking about Vampire Hunter D and its impact, one of the things that I think was really great was Vampire Hunter D was that perfect blend of it felt a little exotic to a lot of American audiences because, as you guys had mentioned, there really wasn't that type of animation here available in the U.S., right? So it was very standard kind of animation in Japan, but it needed to be the right kind of animated feature film to pop with American audiences. If it had been, Lupin the Third was already out, but it didn't really grab with American audiences. There was the comedy that was in it, the culture aspects of it. You had to really know more about Japanese culture for it to have an impact, you could really connect with it. But with Vampire Hunter D, I think because of that horror element, and because of D's personality, I think we were able to latch on, American Western audiences were able to latch on to Vampire Hunter D better. And so that ended up kind of being the gateway to one of the earlier gateways into Japanese animation for here. Besides, obviously we had a lot of kind of cartoons that came from Japan and were then replayed, on American cartoons, but it was like one for one. So as far as movies go, I'm really, really happy that Vampire Hunter D was successful, and really hearkened this whole new, like you said, this we are where we are today because one of the big reasons is because of Vampire Hunter D.
Thank you for listening to Lefty Speaks, the official Vampire Hunter D podcast, hosted by Brandon Easton, Neal Fischer, and Scott McLean. This podcast is created by Unified Pictures and 9 Realms. Narration by Lauren Evallen-Muller. Recording and editing by 9 Realms. Produced by Scott McLean and Ian E. Muller. Based on the works created by Hideyuki Kikuchi. Happy hunting.